I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about the weapons, war strategy, and tactics used by the Cossacks in battles and wars. In particular, Hetman Petro Konashevych-Sahaidachny's inventive strategies and how they helped him save Europe in the War of Khotyn. The first quarter of the 17th century is considered to be the most important time in the development of military skill and strategy of the Cossacks. During that time, it was Petro Konashevych-Sahaidachnyy who was hetman, or leader, of the Cossacks and created a disciplined, well-prepared, and successful army. A sort of Cossack school was also formed, within which significant shifts in strategy and tactics took place. In the first quarter of the 17th century, there was a serious analysis of military operations that took place as well. It is because of these improvements that the Cossack army, also known as the Zaporizhian army, emerged victorious in many wars and campaigns. At the end of the 16th and at the beginning of the 17th century, wars of Western European countries were mainly fought not in national interests, but in the interests of the ruling classes with the aim of gaining wealth, and were of an aggressive nature. Therefore, the strategic goal was achieving political goals on a relatively small scale without extreme tension of forces. This was the most expedient way of waging wars. On the other hand, the military means at the disposal of the countries in Western Europe were also limited. The method of recruiting troops adopted there did not provide for the possibility of forming numerous armed forces. It was especially difficult to replenish losses of trained personnel. It was these factors that influenced the development of a strategic concept in Western Europe, where the goal was not to destroy the enemy's army in a decisive battle. The battle was seen rather as one of the ways to influence the enemy and to get political gains which were desired. An offensive deep into enemy territory was generally considered impossible, once again because of the lack of forces, personnel, weaponry. Controlling the territory usually meant capturing the most important fortresses located on it, which means that geographical objects had primary importance, meanwhile the battle itself secondary. All this led to the formation of one of the leading ideas of the Western European strategy at the time. This idea was that the aim was to maneuver against the enemy's communications without striking at manpower. The essence of maneuvering was to cover one's own communication routes and to create conditions for striking the enemy's communications. Thus, it was necessary to push back the enemy's army and then take possession of the necessary fortresses. However, the Cossacks' aims were different from those of their Western counterparts. Therefore, their strategy was also different. Sahaidachnyy understood that at that time, victory could only be won by decisive offensive actions. And that is why he wanted to avoid all of the maneuvering and besieging fortresses, and chose as the basis of his actions a quick and unexpected attack in order to create the most favorable conditions for his troops. And by using this, he forced the enemy into battle and usually crushed them. The desire to act offensively, the intention to complete every maneuver with a blow, becomes one of the main principles for Sahaidachnyy throughout his military leadership. And in particular, it was a sudden attack with the use of all types of weapons, both cold and firearms. Sahaidachnyy developed his strategy too then, though some ideas were of course similar to that of Western European strategy. The main principles of Sahaidachny's strategy were blocking the main communications and strategic objects in the area of hostilities. That would be fortresses, communication and supply routes. Carrying out multiple battles before the main battle with the aim of exhausting or misleading the enemy. There was also the gathering and directing of the main forces and means of the Zaporizhian army into one main direction, both offensively and defensively, in order to defeat the enemy's army or achieve a decisive result in the shortest time possible and with minimal losses. Some examples of this were the campaign of the Cossack army against Moscow in 1618, as well as the Khotyn War of 1621, which confirmed that the Cossack strategy and tactics were effective for the requirements of the time, and ensured that the Zaporizhian Cossack army gained international authority. To sum up the views of Sahaidachnyy on the tactics and strategy of fighting, he believed that 1. It is important to be active in the offensives and defensives. 2. There must be a quick and thorough assessment of the enemy, taking into account the real situation as an important prerequisite for actions. 3. Complete subordination of the army and clear execution of orders. 4. The army must never scatter its forces along the front line. This thinning out of forces prevents effective battles and does little to protect territory. And 5. The goal was seeking to end the war within one campaign, with one strong, crushing blow. All this became possible thanks to the high degree of preparedness of the army for war, which was achieved due to the uniqueness of the organizational structure of the Zaporizhian Sich, where the entire Cossack population of Ukraine was involved in order to provide human and material reserves. And since this system was created with the aim of maximally mobilizing the forces of the Ukrainian people for their liberation, its capabilities were so great that they allowed the Cossack army to immediately revive after significant losses or defeats. It's uncharacteristic of Europe due to its medieval fragmentation, where gathering a large army was hard because of the many lords and others that would each control their own people and could not always agree. There was a difference in the tactics as well. At that time, namely in the first quarter of the 17th century, linear tactics prevailed in Europe, which was basically the distribution of forces along the front line, lining them up for battle in 2 to 3 lines, where each line would be made up of 4 to 8 lines of people. The 2 or 3 lines would have the distance of about 50 to 200 paces between them. These would be infantry soldiers, and they would fight with firearms mostly. The main method was to fire as a group into the enemy's group, hardly aiming at all. And as a rule, this Western European tactic did not lead to hand-to-hand combat, or the use of cold weapons like spears and swords. Like I've mentioned before, Sahaidachnyy became the supporter of being active in his defense or offense, whatever the case may be, and developed his own system, which was based on mobility, unexpected attacks, and military tricks. At the same time, its main principles were advancement of the avant-garde, maneuvering with 2 flanks, and a quick and decisive battle. The combination of musket fire with the use of cold weapons turned out to be an essential tactic in the overall strategy. In the countries of Western Europe, when using handheld firearms, a bet was made on salvo, meaning a simultaneous discharge of artillery in a battle, and it was also unaimed fire. In the Cossack army, however, the main goal was to increase the accuracy of aimed individual fire. Ukrainian soldiers have learned to create intense and dense fire. Sahaidachnyy reduced the formation of his infantry during the battle to 3 lines, where the first line led the fire, the second passed loaded guns, and the third continuously loaded them. And this made it possible, while ensuring the continuity of fire, to involve the maximum number of shooters, and thereby create a wide frontal strip of dense fire. The formation also minimized human losses from the enemy's artillery fire. According to calculations, this also allowed the Cossacks to fire up to 3 shots per minute, which exceeded the capabilities of Western European infantry by around 8 to 10 times. If the latter needed about 3 minutes to be ready for a new shot, then in the Cossack army, the line that fired a shot was ready for the next one after about 20 to 30 seconds. During the battle, the Ukrainian Cossacks approached the enemy within a shot distance, which is around 300 to 350 steps. They hit them with accurate and intense fire, and then proceeded to a decisive attack with cold weapons. The fire was supposed to partially disorient and demoralize the enemy, disorganize the enemy's fire, and reduce its accuracy. In addition, the smoke from the shots served as a kind of camouflage for the Cossacks. Sahaidachnyy thought hand-to-hand combat to be more important and used firearms only as preparation. And because weapons were such a big part in the Cossacks' strategy, let's talk about them specifically. The development of arms in Ukraine during the Kievan Rus was influenced by the steppe hordes, Varangians, and Byzantines. Offensive and defensive weapons consisted of slings, spears, swords, sabers, battle axes, bows and arrows, and maces. Defensive arms consisted of helmets, sometimes with visors, hauberks or suits of armor and shields. War engines of the catapult and battering ram type were used as well. Beginning with the 14th century, firearms came gradually into use in Ukraine. Heavy firearms, field and fortification artillery for instance, appeared first. Much later, small firearms appeared. The bow in its advanced forms of the arbalest and the crossbow was used in Ukraine up to the 18th century. The arms of the Cossacks consisted of rifles, pistols, pistolets, bows, sabers, spears, battle hammers, and battle picks. In contrast to Western European armies, the Cossacks used no defensive arms, such as the helmet or armor. Only the top Cossacks wore them, and only for ceremonial functions. The first cannons were imported into Ukraine in 1394, and by 1580 the Cossacks were making their own in the Zaporizhian Sich, and there were various types of cannons as well. In the Kievan Rus and the Cossack period, some weapons were imported into Ukraine, but local craftsmen made arms too: swords, sabers, bows, arrows, muskets, cannons, etc. The first cannon foundry was established in Lviv in 1468, and it was Hetman Ivan Mazepa that paid particular attention to developing his artillery in the late 1600s. The combination of strategy and weapons the Cossacks used and made, and their showcase of bravery that can be seen in the lack of armor, has led them to win many a battle. The War of Khotyn, also known as the Battle of Khotyn, is, as I've said before, one of the best representations of Sahaidachny's strategy and its successes, since he played one of the most important roles in the war. The War of Khotyn took place in 1621, near the city of Khotyn in western Ukraine, and its Khotyn fortress. The war can be seen as a war within itself, as well as a battle as part of the greater continental conflict of the time, known as the 30 Years' War. At the time, Khotyn was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also known as Rich Pospolita, as it is known in Ukrainian, Polish, and Lithuanian, which was made up of Poland, Lithuania, and Ruthenia, or Ukraine. But let's take a closer look at the two opposing sides of this war. The attacking side was the Ottoman Empire, Crimean Khanate, and Transylvania. The side defending was the Rich Pospolita, the Zaporizhian Cossacks, and Moldavia. Moldavia, Transylvania, and Crimea were lands that depended on the Ottoman Sultan, Moldavia later transferring to the side of the Rich Pospolita. There were many reasons for conflicts at the time, and especially for this conflict. In 1618, a 30 Years' War between Catholic and Protestant states began in Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth supported the Austrian Habsburg dynasty. Against this background, a conflict arose with the Transylvanian prince, who competed with the Habsburgs for the title of King of Hungary. Therefore, tension grew between the Poles and the Ottomans. Meanwhile, the Cossacks and the Ottomans have had raids on each other for a while and were not in good relations to begin with. The war started with the Battle of Cedzora in 1620, which the Ottomans have won. This meant that a major war was inevitable, and both sides were preparing for it. The Ottomans had their hopes of conquering Ukraine or even the whole of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, reinforced with their victory of Cedzora. King of Poland, Sigismund III Vasa, was forced to seek military assistance from the Cossack army, seeing that he cannot win on his own after the defeat of Cedzora. At the same time, Petro Konashevych-Sahaidachnyy was serious about outlining the plans of the project he had, which was to create a state of Ruthenia, Ukraine, starting with the autonomy of the church. He responded to the Polish request with certain requirements for the autonomy of the Cossack state, which guaranteed rights and freedoms. And after preliminary approval, he entered into the war, in which it seemed he could only lose. Out of about 200,000 participants on the Ottoman side of the battle, 110,000 were actually fighting, and the rest were people to help the servicemen. The army of the Commonwealth leader consisted of 5,000 to 6,000 representatives of the Lithuanian side, about 40,000 Cossacks, as well as the Polish army, which was 25,000 to 30,000 Cossacks. Some historians say that the Ottoman army was 2 or even 2.5 times the size of the Cossacks and the Commonwealth combined. Finally, in August 1621, all met near Khotyn. At the beginning of September, one of the fiercest battles took place. The Ottomans led 3 assaults with cannon fire onto the Cossacks, with the last one lasting for more than an hour. It was such heavy fire that the Poles wrote, quote, "It was doubtful that the Cossacks would remain alive." End of quote. The Cossacks could not fight back with cannons or artillery. They did not have as much, and it was not part of their strategy, as I've discussed earlier. Instead, they've created trenches and defensive lines, a dugout really, to wait for the artillery raids of the Ottomans to pass, as well as to utilize them for active defense. And then they would launch counterattacks at unexpected moments and especially at night, and deep into the enemy's position. The goal was to reduce the manpower of the enemy. It was often that Sahaidachnyy was met with opposition from the Polish High Command, which had a strategy similar to the Western European one I've previously described. The Cossack strategy did, however, bring success, and it also brought bonuses. The raids into enemy territory allowed for replenishing stocks of weapons, ammunition, and provisions. They also allowed for an opportunity of startling the enemy and winning in hand-to-hand combat, which the Cossacks were well trained in and their enemy not prepared for. A participant in the Khotyn War, Sobieski, wrote, quote, "After the unexpected invasion of the Zaporizhians into the Sultan's camp, the Turks were seized with panic. People of all ranks were gripped by anxiety. The Sultan himself, who had so recently thought that there was no one in the world more powerful than himself, now saw with his own eyes the precariousness of his position, and his previous self-confidence gave way to feminine complaints when he was convinced of the groundlessness of his hopes. His plans, with the help of which he had hoped to defeat not only the Polish army, but also to conquer the entire globe, were dispelled. Now there is only hope for a shameful peace." End of quote. It was this strategy that brought tactical victory to the Cossacks, and through them to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in this war. Sultan Osman II was forced to start peace negotiations, which actually meant his military and political defeat, considering his foolproof starting positions and an advantage in the number of troops. After all, he had an army twice as large as the opponents. On October 9th, the Khotyn Peace Treaty of 1621 was concluded, which put an end to the war and returned the positions of the parties to the starting conditions a few years prior. 2 years later, in 1623, Bartholomew Zimurovich, a poet from Lviv, published an epic poem in Poland in memory of the Khotyn War of 1621. In it, he described the fight and victory of the Cossacks near Khotyn, the Cossacks which he called Ukrainians, noting their role in the defense of the whole of Europe.
Козак задумай, сказав дівчино, прощай, ти конику вороненьки неси та гуляй. Пості, козаче, твоя дівчина плаче, як ти ж мене покидаєш, тільки подумай. Лучше не ходи, лучше не люби, лучше не знай, чи тебе забувай. Лучше не ходи, лучше не люби, лучше не знай, чи тебе забувай. Вийшла ручки заломивши і тяженько заплакавши, як ти ж мене покидаєш, тільки подумай. Білих ручок не ламай, ясних очей не співай, мене завіри славою в собі ожидай. Лучше не ходи, лучше не люби, лучше не знай, чи тебе забувай. Лучше не ходи, лучше не люби, лучше не знай, чи тебе забувай. Не хочу я нікого, тільки тебе одного. Ти здоров будь, мій миленький, а все пропадай. Виснув козака на коня, оставайся здорова. Як не згину, то вернуся через 3 года. Лучше не ходи, лучше не люби, лучше не знай, чи тебе забувай. Лучше не ходи, лучше не люби, лучше не знай, чи тебе забувай.
Thank you so much for joining me today, and this was what we need to know about Ukraine this week.